Today we'll be talking about contingency contracting, funding of contingency operations. The lesson objectives are describe the various legislative controls imposed with the use of appropriated funds, demonstrate familiarity with the terminology associated with fiscal law, demonstrate understanding of a funding citation, and describe various O&M MILCON and related sub-appropriations used in a contingency. Fiscal law. No money shall be drawn from the Treasury but in consequence of appropriations made by law. According to the Constitution, only Congress has the ability to provide funds to be spent by the executive branch. Two things that derive from fiscal law are Appropriations and Authorizations Acts, and it establishes legislative controls. So by law, Congress has a power of the pursue. Agencies within the executive branch, like DoD, cannot obligate money until it's been made available through annual appropriations and authorizations acts. Appropriations and authorizations. The definitions for these are as follows. Authorizations establishes programs and indicates the purpose Congress intends for appropriated money and often contains restrictions on how the money may be spent. Appropriations makes money available for various purposes as indicated by Congress. So authorization equals program, appropriations equals money on that program. Transfer and reprogramming, often required to ensure funds are the right type and amount for expenditure. Reprogramming is the movement within an appropriation. Transfer is movement from one appropriation to another. Reprogramming is authorized. Transfer is not unless you have separate statutory authority above the CCO level. So an example of reprogramming would be if you need to move funds between O&M Army and O&M Navy, that would be okay because it's reprogramming. An example of transfer would be if you're trying to move funds between O&M and UMC. That would be unacceptable because we can only do reprogramming. So unless there's a statute that authorizes. Commitments. Administrative reservation of funds for a particular purpose, fenced off, signed by a certifying official, provides the correct funding citation. Those eligible to be appointed certifying officials include commanders, deputy commanders, resource managers, fund holders, travel authorizing officials, and purchase card approving officials. And according to DFAS-DE-7000.5-R, contracting officers and legal advisors cannot be appointed certifying officials. Obligations. Obligations are a quid pro quo, a promise of money for a promise of delivery. It is a legally binding action that creates a liability for the government. It occurs when a contract action containing funds is signed, and it's the time of award, and the award must be signed by a warranted contracting officer. Disbursements. A disbursement is a payment made by finance or paying agent, usually in cash. Paying agents are appointed in writing by a commander or finance officer. CCOs may be appointed as paying agents. Things to consider are mission requirements, replenishment of funds, capability to safeguard, exchange rate if paying in foreign currency, and record-keeping responsibilities. Legislative controls. There are three limitations on the expenditure of funds. One is color, two is year, the third is amount. An agency may obligate and expend appropriations only of a proper purpose, color, within time limits applicable to the appropriation and within amounts established by Congress. In addition to providing authorization and appropriation acts, Congress influences the procurement system by establishing legislative controls on how the funds are to be spent. 31 U.S.C. 1301A, commonly referred to as the Purpose Statute, It prohibits spending money on objects other than those for which appropriations were made. The purpose statute typically refers to the concept of color of money, which means appropriated funds must be expended for that purpose established by Congress. To check what you're purchasing, to check if what you're purchasing is necessary, use the necessary expense rule. It's a three-pronged test. So, is what you're purchasing logically related to the appropriation's general purpose? Is it not prohibited by law? And is it not otherwise provided for by another appropriation? 31 USC 102A is called the bona fide need statute. This constraint limits the expenditure of a fund to a definite period of availability. It also states that a bona fide need must exist at the time award is made, when the money is obligated, not when the performance is scheduled to begin. For example, O&M has a period of availability of one fiscal year, so 1 October through 30th September, since it is an annual appropriation. Multi-year appropriations are RDT&E, which is 2 years, and construction, which is 5 years, and procurement for 3 years. A general rule is the need must exist at the time of award, and the contract must be completed within the period of availability. Bona fide need for supplies. Supplies are considered proper if needed to support an operation in a given fiscal year and ordered and used in the same fiscal year. Supplies ordered in one fiscal year and not used until the next fiscal year is considered improper unless there's a stock level exception. Stock level exception is replenishment of stock levels, safety levels, mobilization requirements, and authorized backup stocks. Excess of normal usage, even for a price break, is not authorized. And lead time exception. If goods or materials will not be obtainable at the time needed because of the time to order, produce, fabricate, and deliver them requires they be purchased in a prior fiscal year. Bona fide need for services. Current funds are used to obtain current services, but may not use current funds to obtain future services. Services generally don't cross fiscal years unless it's non-severable by their nature, cannot be divided for performance into separate fiscal years. Statutory permits the use of current year funds to acquire services that continue over the end of a fiscal year, even if the services are severable, provided the duration is no longer than 12 months. For example, utilities, trash disposal, etc. Life cycle of funds. Definition of current is money whose availability for new obligations has not yet expired under the terms for that appropriation. Example, O&M is 1 year. Expired is money whose availability has expired for new obligations but are available to make adjustments and liquidate previous obligations. And canceled, money that is no longer available for any purpose. One way to understand this concept is with this chart. As you can see, O&M funds for fiscal year 00 are available for obligation from 1 October 99 through 30 September 00, as shown by the green bar. During this period, the agency can use these funds subject to the bona fide need rule. However, the agency must use caution after 30 September 00, see the yellow bar, because they expire on that date. They are no longer available for new obligations, but the agency may use them for limited purposes to adjust the existing contract. Common adjustments include changes requiring the contractor to perform additional work. The work, however, must be in scope. If you have a contract change that is in scope and the cost is within what is remaining in the expired funds, you would use the old money expired to fund the change. This expired period lasts for 5 years. The money is not for new obligations, adjustments only. After the 5 year period, in this case 30 September 05, the agency must stop, red bar, using the money for any purpose. The money is now closed or cancelled. It is graveyard dead. It is not available for any purpose. If there is any money remaining, they become miscellaneous receipts and go back to the treasury. The third legislative control is amount, which basically means that you may not spend more than is available. and you may not exceed regulatory limitations for the purpose. For example, O&M funds may be used for the purchase of end items up to 100K. Beyond the 100K, use procurement funds. O&M funds may be used for construction up to 750K. Construction to correct life, health, or safety threatening deficiencies may use O&M up to 1.5 million. Future year funds. In cases where future year appropriations are required, contracts must contain a provision that specifically states the contract is conditioned upon the availability of funds. So 52-232-18 and 52-232-19. The Feed and Forage Act allows DoD to contract for clothing, subsistence, forage, fuel, quarters, transportation, or medical supplies for the current fiscal year, even in the absence of an appropriation. As noted in the Operational Law Handbook, this act was invoked to support Operation Desert Shield. Of course, Congress will subtract the amount DoD uses when they authorize this budget. Augmentation, an action by an agency that increases the effective amount of funds available in an agency's appropriation, generally results in expending funds in excess of the amount Congress originally appropriated and generally prohibited by Congress but can enact special interagency transaction authorities. It is not a CCO responsibility. Another way Congress authorizes the lawful augmentation of accounts is to enact special interagency transaction authorities. A good example of this, as used in the Fiscal Law, Chapter 12, segment of the Operational Law Handbook, Tab E, is where Congress may authorize DoD assistance to drug enforcement operations. This assistance is reimbursable unless the support occurs during normal training operations and DoD receives a benefit from the operation. What Congress wants to prevent is agencies making deals between each other when it comes to funding operations. One example is from Cuban refugees where Department of Justice kicked in funds authorized by Congress for DoD to run this operation. It was virtually a DOJ investment to avoid problems of illegal immigration these refugees could have caused. Violations of fiscal law. According to 31 U.S.C. 1341A, the Anti-Deficiency Act prohibits obligations in excess of funds available, prohibits obligations in excess of amounts permitted by regulation, and prohibits obligations in advance of appropriation. A knowing or willful violation is punishable by a fine of $5,000, 2 years in prison, or both. All violations are required to be investigated and reported to Congress. Now we'll be moving on to funding citations, and the way you read the example down below, 821-3-2020 is positions 1 through 2 are a Akron, 3 to 4 the agency, 5 is fiscal year, and the 6th through 9th are the appropriation. Akron, positions 1 through 2. They are alphabetic and serve as a reference identifier to the line of accounting. A second line of accounting begins AB. Agency, positions 3 to 4. An example is 17 is Department of the Navy, includes the Marines. 21 is the Department of the Army. 57, which is us, is the Department of the Air Force, and 97, which is the Department of Defense. So take for example AA 213-2020. We see that it is the first line of account for this contract. We also see that it is Army, and we know that the 3 indicates that it is fiscal year 303 dollars. So since we know it is Army money, we simply look down the column until we match up the appropriation, and we see that 2020 is in fact O&M dollars. This list isn't all inclusive, but it gives you an idea of the various types of appropriations within DoD. Other funding procedures. Typical problem areas in determining necessary expenses are vehicle rentals for recreational activities, recreational supplies, entertainment, awards, gifts, coins, clothing, medical supplies and services, meals and food, which is fresh fruit, vegetables, and bread, legal claims payable to host government, foreign companies, citizens, and other U.S. agencies and companies, fuels, oil, grease, gases, etc. Recording obligations. There are a few different ways to fund contracts depending on the situation. It's important to understand the general funding policies and the requirements associated with contract formation and time limitations. Full funding is a budgetary concept. An agency may initiate a buy for an item only if the funds for total estimated contract costs are available for obligation. In general, fixed price contracts are fully funded except for approved incrementally funded situations, R&D, base environmental remediation. When annual appropriations fund service contracts, the term of contract funded shall not extend beyond the end of the fiscal year except when authorized by law. For example, you may execute contracts providing unseverable O&M itself, not funds, or continuing services prior to the funding authorization with the expectation funds will be coming. Now you may include even the severable services, those not extending beyond a 12-month period. If funds do not arrive, the government may terminate the contract with no obligation. Economy Act Order. In some situations, it's wiser to let another agency contract for your needs or use a contract the agency already has set up. 31 U.S.C. 1535 provides the general authority for federal interagency transactions or orders. Contract offloading, as it is sometimes referred, is a beneficial management tool if used properly. However, it is not a means to circumvent competition and limitations imposed on the use of funds, nor should we use it to do things like order through DOE to bypass a limitation in our DFARS. Due to this and the fact that a KO's main job is to obtain support for his or her customers by dealing with contractors, not other federal agencies, we require certain things before. Military departments normally use this form to transfer funds between themselves and from itself to another federal agency. O&M sub-appropriations. E&D expense funds are special funds within O&M allowing DoD secretaries to spend money therein without regard to other provisions of law. However, the purpose must be determined to be proper. It cannot be used as representational funds such as for classified projects, entertainment expenses, personal items, or repair or maintenance of DoD facilities. E and EEXs and ORFs are sometimes called secretarial contingency funds, but don't let that word contingency fool you. Here it could mean any unplanned need rather than a military operation. We noted its 5-year period as well as its specified flavors. Now let's look at other MILCON differences in accordance with 10 USC 2805A. The Unspecified Minor Military Construction UMMC program provides DoD annual funding at the dollar amounts shown for minor projects not specifically approved in a MILCON Appropriations Act. For emergencies, construction funds may be pulled from any unobligated MILCON. There are 3 types of ECAs that could take place. Other related appropriations permits the U.S. to provide foreign assistance and military security assistance. It serves essentially the same purposes as AECA, but reimbursement standards are flexible and allow for augmentation. It's for foreign disaster relief under FAA limited to 50 million annually. FAA is divided into 2 parts. Part 1 is geared toward helping a nation's general population. Congress imposes fewer constraints here. Part 2 for aiding their defense posture. Congress controls to prevent U.S. from being the world's arms merchant. DOS will reimburse DoD fully for Part 2 even if DOS did not get or seek it. For Part 1, no recovery may be authorized. This may mean free is good for the assisted country. Now on to DERF, Defense Emergency Response Fund. It's initially capitalized at $100 million, no year funds, restricted to domestic disaster relief, requires SecDef determination that action is required prior to formal assistance request, avoids DoD jeopardizing O&M accounts by providing assistance in the absence of reimbursement agreement, and the customer is required to reimburse amounts withdrawn from DERF. In the domestic disaster relief operations arena, DoD normally awaits a call for assistance from an agency like FEMA and gets reimbursed for support provided under DERF. Under DERF, SecDef has the authority to act prior to receiving a request for assistance. However, DoD may not get reimbursement if SecDef does so. Two examples are SecDef okayed water bombing the Malibu fires, but said to wait before aid after the Northridge earthquake. This indicates she or he has to predict that we'll get the request. This fund is designed to offset impact to our O&M. Like DWCF, this is no year money, but it's not a black hole. From DERF to the Stafford Disaster and Emergency Relief Act, codified as 42 USC 5121-5203, requires presidential direction, reimbursement limited to expenses above normal operating levels, reimbursement only if FEMA requested the assistance. Mission letter from FEMA includes not to exceed reimbursement amount. Funding sources are varied. Reimbursements for domestic disaster relief operations are accomplished under this act. Agencies may respond to these emergencies with or without reimbursement under presidential authority. However, FEMA only must request assistance here by directing a mission for DoD activities for required support if we want reimbursement. Funds for reimbursement may come from several sources, example legislation, grants, etc., but FEMA controls them. Foreign funds. Section 607 of Foreign Assistance Act authorizes U.S. government to furnish commodities and services to friendly foreign countries. It includes peacekeeping and disaster relief efforts on a reimbursable basis. UN Section 7 of United Nations Participation Act, UNPA, authorizes U.S. to furnish services, facilities, or other assistance when requested by the United Nations on a reimbursable basis, unless waived by the SEC state, after consulting with SecDef. Acquisition and Cross-Servicing Agreement, NATO Mutual Support Act, Public Law 96-323 provides DoD with simplified authority to acquire logistic support without resorting to AECA. Commander's Emergency Response Program, CERP, SERP. Purpose: enable commanders to respond to urgent humanitarian relief and reconstruction assistance by executing programs that will immediately assist the Iraqi populace. General Guidance/Uses, MNF CG MNC-I, Frago 84-5, directs commanders to focus on urgent projects that will employ substantial numbers of Iraqi workers. It can be used for goods or services and make best efforts to identify or employ local Iraqi firms. This can help with emergency repairs of critical facilities, critical infrastructure shortfalls that can be rapidly resolved, and projects to reduce the risk of injury to local populace, procurement of critical equipment to replace lost, stolen, non-repairable items or to establish critical community essential services, rapid reconstruction following combat operations. C7 or C9 generally the first stop on the MNC-I staff. SERP-specific uses: water and sanitation infrastructure, food production and distribution, agriculture, electrical power generation and distribution, healthcare, education, telecommunications, economic, financial, and management improvements, transportation, rule of law and governance, irrigation, civic cleanup activities, civic support vehicles, repair to civic or cultural facilities, other humanitarian or reconstruction projects. Humanitarian assistance. In this final part of this unit, we'll define and examine the constraints and controls associated with HCA. Broadly defined, HCA comprises all activities which help foreign nations improve the quality of life for the civilian population. Primary responsibility for HCA, like most U.S. and international issues, lies with the DOS via the U.S. Agency of International Development, USAID. Since DoD's changing missions results in expansion into more of these types of operations, it and DOS receive separate appropriations for humanitarian assistance. These special 2-year O&M funds we briefly discussed on a previous slide should fund any significant HCA projects. Thus, we should not use general or exercise O&M for the same purpose. Operations where we've used HCA are Restore Hope in Somalia, Support Hope in Rwanda, Provide Comfort in Iraq, and Uphold Democracy in Haiti. HCA constraints. We are limited to the 5 areas listed here: medical dental and veterinary care, construction of rudimentary surface transportation systems, well drilling and construction of basic sanitation facilities, rudimentary construction and repair of public facilities, detecting and clearing landmines. And here's a summary. Match the right funds to various requirements or needs. Understand the limitations, purposes of O&M, HCA, and other funds enable to a contracting officer to get the right color of money. And be familiar with fiscal law. Being familiar with fiscal law helps to ensure legal and proper obligation of funds, prevents abuses and anti-deficiency violations.